Welcome. My talk will be on generic extensions in contemporary British poetry, a film poem and a dramatic poetry collection as outstanding examples. I will discuss two examples of generic extension of lyric poetry in recent British writing, which combine lyrical features with structural elements of diverse other genres, with film and narrative in Tony Harrison's The Shadow of Hiroshima of 1995, and with drama and narrative in Glyn Maxwell's The Sugar Mile of 2005. The following analyses are based on the premise that a lyric poem is prototypically characterized by two features: brevity together with prosodical overstructuring, which foregrounds the artifice of the text, and a monological speech situation, which tends to blur the speaker-author distinction and may be perceived either fictionally or factually. Generic transitions of lyric poetry did occur in earlier periods, notably in sonnet sequences and verse narratives, but the two examples analyzed here are innovative in their generic extension. Tony Harrison's The Shadow of Hiroshima of 1995 is a film poem, the coupling of a poetic text on an acoustic track with a visual track on the commemoration of the atomic bomb attack on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, broadcast by the BBC on the 50th anniversary of this event in 1995. The poetic sequence is presented by an authorial speaker, the voice of Tony Harrison himself, who leads through the preparations for the annual ceremony commemorating the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima, starting on August the 5th and ending on the following morning, when after the moment of the atomic blast, the peace doves are released. The voice of Harrison introduces, as a guide through part of the day, the subordinate speaker, Shadow's son, that is, Mr. Shadow, the imaginary figure of an anonymous man with a fan whose shadowy outline was stamped onto the ground by the blast and who represents all victims of the attack. Shadow's son is on 1 day's parole, line 3, as it were, and accompanies the narrative up to the moment when 50 years earlier he was incinerated by the bomb, what he calls his burning time. The narrative consists of his recollections of the past and his thwarted longings for an ordinary life, especially his love for a girl, interwoven with descriptions of the build-up for the ceremony of releasing the peace doves beneath the A-bomb peace dome. Thus, the progress of the poem contrasts details about the horrible deaths of the victims in the past with the present preparations by the keepers of pigeons for the commemoration, as well as the activities of present-day inhabitants of the city, such as performing gymnastics, painting pictures of the peace dome, and making love in a love hotel. The narrative ends on the morning of A-bomb day with a commemorative ceremony and the flight and return of the peace doves, during which some are attacked by hawks. In his concluding comments, the authorial speaker associates the attacks by the hawks with Japan's aggressive behavior before and during the war, adding that the threat of war will persist in spite of these peace rituals. Is the world at peace tonight, or are we all like Shadow's son, facing inferno with a fan? The appeal for peace as the reaction to the experience of a devastating war is undermined by disturbing prospects for the future. The lyrical quality of this narrative sequence consists formally in the use of the brilliantly rhymed iambic tetrameter, for instance in the two lines, "Hiroshima hawks are glad to glut and gorge themselves on peace dove gut." And it consists rhetorically in the differentiated use of perspective confronting two subjective views, On the one hand, the authorial voice impersonates Shadow's son, rendering his past experiences of loss and destruction with emotional intensity up to the moment where the shadow has to depart, reliving the moment of his nuclear incineration. I saw the saddened shade retire to face again the flash and fire. On the other, the superordinate instance of Harrison's own voice describes the trivial present-day activities forgetful of the past inferno, such as looking after pigeons or visiting pinball arcades. The authentic presentation of the poet's voice endorses the factual stance of the utterance, thus reinforcing a feature potentially characteristic of lyric poetry, the identification of speaker with author, which cannot be rendered in print and is achieved here by the acoustic mediation of the poem. This identification is even more prominent in Harrison's film poem The Blasphemer's Banquet of 1989, the polemic defense of Salman Rushdie against the Islamic fatwa, where the acoustic presence of Harrison's voice is corroborated by his visual presence in person, acting as the host of the banquet in honor of Rushdie. The visual track serves two functions. On the one hand, the pictures illustrate what is being described in the text. Shadow's son's silhouette burned into the pavement, views of the city of Hiroshima, people's activities such as morning gymnastics, the flight of the doves and later of the hawks. On the other hand, these illustrations function as a mundane contrast to the remembrance of the devastating blast and the complete destruction of the city and its inhabitants. The double medial extension, acoustic and visual, of the poem thus corroborates the effect of the poetic text in two ways. The soundtrack, voice and music, supports the meaning of the poem directly. The visual track serves this effect indirectly by offering pictures of present-day phenomena which are in contrast to and forgetful of the past catastrophe. Strictly speaking, the transmedial extension of the text does not noticeably transcend the meaning of the poem, but intensifies its impact, authenticating the narrative with respect to the mediated subject matter as well as to the mediating instance. Glyn Maxwell's The Sugar Mile of 2005 deals with two historic scenes of aerial attacks on cities, interlinking them via monthly date. The terrorist attack on the Twin Towers in New York City on September the 11th, 2001, and the German air raid on London on September the 7th, 1940. Black Saturday, the beginning of the Blitz, two scenes of massive urban destruction, both happening in early September, 61 years apart. These two incidents are further linked by the presence of one identical witness in both scenes. Joey Stone, an adolescent in London in 1940, and an old man in New York in 2001. Both situations are conveyed by altogether 59 poems, monologues or soliloquies spoken by the characters present in the respective scenes. The scene in New York is set in a bar on Broadway on September the 8th and 9th, that is, the weekend before the attack, where three characters meet. The barkeeper Raoul, the regular customer Joey, and the author, who himself does not speak and is only seen writing, addressed by the other two as Glyn, Glenn, or Clint, inaccurately for Glyn. The scene in London, set in an area just devastated by bombs, is represented by young Joey together with his grandmother, and especially by members of the Prey family, Mother Betsy and her 5 children, Harry, Robbie, Sally, Julie, and baby Lily. The Preys have been bombed out and are later accommodated in a school close to the Tate and Lyle sugar factory in the East End of London, to which the title The Sugar Mile refers. The monologues are composed as lyric poems, exemplifying a variety of forms and devices, some traditional, like sestina and terza rima, others newly invented, all rhythmic, and with a broad spectrum of sound figures such as pure rhymes, identical rhymes, para-rhymes, internal rhymes, different stanzaic forms, and varying line lengths, interspersed with rhymeless verses and prose. Stylistically, the poems avoid conventional poetic diction, employing colloquial speech, both English and American. Stanzaic forms are used to differentiate the various characters. Joey speaks couplets, Raoul sestinas, Harry quatrains, Robbie free verse. Among the monologues, only one dialogue poem stands out, spoken by Joey and Julie, indicative of the central importance of their relationship for the plot. What the various prosodic devices achieve is imposing a foregrounding poetic superstructure on the realistic experiences and utterances in a historically, regionally, and socially specific setting. The poems, with that one exception, are united by another common lyric feature, the monological speech situation. While the individual monologues are lyrical in their prosodic and rhetorical setup, the arrangement of the poems is both dramatic and narrative. Dramatic in that the two groupings of monologues convey the situation of 2001 and 1940 with the respective constellation and interrelation of the two sets of characters. Narrative in that the monologues are ordered by two chronologies constituting two narrative sequences, one set in 2001 in New York, the other in 1940 in London. The second sequence, London 1940, is intertwined with the first, New York 2001. The primary time level is September 2001, from which the situation in London 61 years earlier is imaginatively recreated by Joey. The combination of the three generic dimensions, lyrical, dramatic, narrative, provides a complex overview of the two historical and national situations, and their interrelation creates imaginative extensions in various respects. The texts of the individual lyrical poems present a subjective focus in each case at one specific moment, separating it both from the other personal perspectives and from its development in time. The effect consists in the imaginative recreation of a particular experience from a specific personal perspective. The dramatic constellation of these moments then extends the individual point of view to the wider interpersonal angle of multi-perspectivity, which relativizes each individual view but also highlights its specificity. The temporal succession of these momentary experiences constitutes a narrative of the changes of the situation and the development of the characters over time, in the form of two narratives, one set in 2001, the other in 1940. The narrative of the past development in 1940 concerns the bombing out of the Prey family in London, temporary accommodation in a school, promised but never accomplished evacuation to the country, and finally extinction by a direct hit on the school. The central phase, however, inside that sequence is the developing friendship between Joey and Julie Prey, whom he first met during the winter of 1939-1940, with whom he had one intimate conversation presented in the singular dialogue poem, and whose secret diary, expressing her affection for him, he later dug up in the garden and copied out. This discovery counts as the happy, eventful turn within the narrative sequence. The positive event is, however, followed by the negative event of Julie's annihilation, together with that of her entire family in the bomb blast. Joey alone had been spared because he had gone to the Prey's garden to dig for the buried heirloom. The primary narrative sequence, set in 2001, features two events, one foreseeable for the future: the death of Raoul when he will begin his new job in one of the Twin Towers on September the 11th, the other happening at the end, the handing over of the yellow envelope. Maxwell's collection, The Sugar Mile, thus tells two stories in the medium of poems. The subordinate story of two families affected by the Blitz in 1940, the Preys and the Stones, and the superordinate story of how this past story came to be narrated by a witness in 2001. One further aspect concerns the actual composition of the poems. The two chronological sequences together are opened and closed by the same poem of almost identical wording spoken by the author in his own person, the only instance in the collection of the poet's voice. However, the poet, as the superordinate recording instance, is present throughout the collection in that he is being observed while writing and spoken to by the other two characters in the Broadway bar, Joey and Raoul. The precise information about date and place, September the 8th, Broadway and 86th Street, preceding the untitled opening poem, defines the scene: Manhattan 3 days prior to the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001. A proleptic reference to the future attack is contained in this poem when the speaker describes people jumping and falling in an attempt to escape from the burning tower, among whom will also be barkeeper Raoul. Thus, the opening poem establishes a wider temporal perspective for the reader who, unlike the characters, is aware of the impending catastrophe, which makes the two situations in 1940 and 2001 directly comparable. The other event on this level is the handing over of the yellow envelope from Joey to Glyn, poet and gentleman, as it says on the envelope, from one writer to another, as it were, presumably Joey's recollections and imaginary reconstructions of his experience of the Blitz in London and of his acquaintance with the Prey family, especially Julie, and thus the source for all the monologues set in 1940. This interpretation is corroborated by the closing poem, which repeats the untitled opening poem, now given the title The Sugar Mile, and dedicated to Joseph Stone. The affinity between author and Joey is also underlined by the fact that the opening and closing poem is composed in couplets, like Joey's monologues. Both poems thus implicitly refer to the composition of the entire collection, naming its source and inspiration. This overall setup and the specific wording of the poet's identical opening and closing poem point to one significant feature of Maxwell's collection: the absence of the authorial voice, generally considered to be a potential feature of lyric poetry. This absence is expressed in several elusive phrases in the opening and closing poem. I quote various passages. There can be no first person. The poet is any stranger seen today whose past is an empty notebook, whose past is an empty moleskin. In both cases, the text is followed by some lines crossed out, implying that the poem could not be completed. The poet withdraws and delegates perception and utterance to the characters, like in a drama, indicating that vis-à-vis such experiences of violence, the superior position of a superordinate voice is no longer feasible. What the generic transitions of poetry in the Sugar Mile achieve is the temporal expansion of the isolated lyric utterance into a longer narrative sequence and the interpersonal expansion of the isolated voice into a broader dramatic constellation and dynamic progression together with the foregrounding of the act of poetic imagination and composition. In this respect, there is a marked contrast to the Shadow of Hiroshima. While Harrison emphasizes both the presence and the creative activity of himself as the author, Maxwell explicitly denies any active participation in the composition of the poems, at the same time, however, conspicuously drawing attention to his presence at the scene and to his fruitless attempts at writing, as well as his final decision to abandon the attempt altogether. Empty notebook. Although he still remains the author responsible for the composition, he effaces his presence behind the reality of the characters and their situation, in the interest of heightening the intersubjective relevance of the experiences he mediates. This interest is connected with the suggested factuality of the depicted situations. In this respect, Maxwell concurs with Harrison, who also stresses the factuality of the presented happenings, specifically by means of the visual extension of the poetic text, pictures of the atomic blast, details of the city of Hiroshima, and of the annual commemoration of the catastrophe. But while Harrison clarifies the present situation in its relation to the past, Maxwell refrains from clarifying the past in every respect, requiring the reader to puzzle out what actually happened, indication of the withdrawal of authorial control. Thank you.